There is a cold wind that blows through every corner of the world George R.R. Martin built. You can feel it in the pages of his books, in the silence before the opening credits of the show, in the way the very first scene, before a single word of dialogue, before a single named character, takes us beyond a great ice wall, into a darkness so thick and so old, it feels less like a fictional place, and more like something inherited, something that comes from a part of the human mind that remembers when winter truly was a threat to survival. That wind carries a story, and it is older than the Targaryens and their dragons. It is older than the Andals and their seven-pointed faith. It is older than the Wall itself, older than kings, older than nations. It is a story that begins in darkness, in war, in a desperate act of magic that went very wrong, and it ends at Winterfell, in a godswood lit by cold blue eyes, on a night so long that soldiers gave it a name that echoes down 8,000 years of history. This is the secret history between House Stark and the White Walkers. It is not simply the story of a family that happened to live closest to the threat. It is not the story of unlucky geography or brave northerners standing on the front lines of someone else's war. What we are going to explore today goes so much deeper than that. Every time a Stark child is born with the ability to slip into the mind of a wolf and see through its eyes, that is not random. Every time the words "winter is coming" are spoken as a warning, not merely weather, but something ancient and deliberate. That is not just a motto. It's every time someone tells Bran Stark that there must always be a Stark in Winterfell, as though the castle itself would crack open and something terrible would bleed out if the bloodline were absent, they are repeating a truth so old that the people who first understood it are bones beneath the earth. The Starks and the White Walkers are bound together, not by accident, not by proximity, by blood, by marek, by a history that has been deliberately buried, deliberately forgotten, written out of the records, forbidden on pain of death. And as we follow this thread from its very beginning, from a world before men, through the birth of the first undead creature, through the age of heroes and the long night, through the dark legend of the Night's King, it's through the return of the dead in the era of Robert Baratheon and beyond, a pattern emerges so clear and so unsettling that it changes everything about how you understand the story. Most people who love Game of Thrones think they know the White Walker storyline. They know the Night King was created by the Children of the Forest. They know Arya killed him. They know the wall came down. They have the broad strokes. But the broad strokes are not the story. The story is in the details that the show and the books scatter like deliberate breadcrumbs across thousands of pages and hundreds of episodes. Details that only mean something when you hold them up to the light and look at them all at once. Details like the fact that old Nan, the old caretaker who told the Stark children their bedtime stories, it seems to have known things she had absolutely no rational way of knowing. Details like the specific and very strange construction choices at Winterfell that have no practical explanation and every magical one. Details like the way Bran's green dreams did not begin with his training north of the Wall, but with a raven-shaped vision in his very first night of unconsciousness after the fall, reaching toward him out of a deep darkness with three eyes open. The magic that runs through the Stark family is not incidental to the White Walker plot. It is the White Walker plot. The Starks are not bystanders to this history. They are woven into its very fabric. From the moment the first Stark placed their hands on the bark of the weirwood in Winterfell's godswood and felt something answer back, and all the way to the moment Arya's blade touched cold blue fire and ended 8,000 years of patient, accumulating darkness in a single exhaled breath. So, pull your cloak a little tighter, let the fire burn a little lower, and listen carefully, because this is the kind of history that gets people killed for knowing. This is the kind of history that powerful families erase from their own records, that meisters dismiss as children's stories, that is maintained only by old women in warm halls who whisper to frightened children in the dark, because they know, the way old Nan knew, that the most dangerous things in any world are the things that everyone has agreed to stop believing in. Let us begin at the beginning, the real beginning, when the world was young and cold and the earth was still dreaming. So Part 1, The World Before Men. When the earth was still dreaming, to understand the connection between the Starks and the White Walkers, you have to begin not with the Starks and not with the White Walkers, but with the world before either of them existed. You have to go back to the Dawn Age, which is what scholars and Meister historians in Westeros call the long era before any human set foot on that continent. back to a time when the only people living on that great green landmass from the summer sea to the shivering sea were a people unlike anything we recognize as human today. They called themselves those who sing the songs of the earth. The giants called them something stranger, a phrase in the giant tongue that scholars have translated roughly as little squirrel people, which tells you something about how physically small these beings were. But small does not mean powerless, and the children of the forest, which is what the first men who eventually encountered them called them, a name that stuck, were among the most magically capable beings the known world had ever produced. They were ancient beyond counting. Their civilization, if you can call it that, predated every empire and every kingdom. The Valyrian freehold, which many consider the greatest civilization in the history of Essos, only existed for about 5,000 years before the doom consumed it. The children had inhabited Westeros for an amount of time so large it stops having real meaning, a span measured not in centuries but in geological epochs. They were not quite human. They stood no taller than a human child, with large golden cat-like eyes that could pierce through darkness. Their skin was brown and mottled in a way that let them blend with the forest floor. They did not build cities, they did not forge metal, they did not raise armies in the conventional sense. They lived in harmony with the forests and the rivers, worshipping nameless gods through the sacred weirwood trees, those enormous pale trees with red leaves that bled a sap the color of blood, and that bore curved staring faces. These faces were not merely decorative. The children had discovered, through generations of magical practice so old it had become instinct, that consciousness could be impressed upon wood and stone, that the weirwood trees with their deep, interconnected root systems could hold memory, could hold awareness, could hold the echoes of the dead in a network that stretched beneath the soil, like an invisible nervous system running under the entire continent. The Green Seers were the most gifted of the children. These were individuals born with particularly vivid magical sight, the ability to look through the carved faces of weirwood trees anywhere in the network, to see events happening at great distances, to peer backward into history through the accumulated memories stored in the wood, and in rare cases to see forward, dimly, like watching something through frosted glass. A Green Seer was essentially a living archive, a bridge between the present and the vast, stored past of the world itself. The process of fully merging with the weirwood network was slow and difficult. And over time, a Green Seer would become more and more rooted, literally, to one location, sitting within the roots of an enormous weirwood, their body gradually merging with the wood, their consciousness expanding outward through the network until they were less a person and more a living library of accumulated sight. The wargs were a related but distinct gift. Where Green Seers could look through stone and wood, wargs could enter the consciousness of animals. A warg would slip out of their own mind and into the warm, instinct-driven awareness of a wolf or an eagle or a bear, experiencing the world through senses far sharper than any human could possess. The direwolves, those enormous creatures that now seem almost mythical, were particularly valued as companions for wargs. Their intelligence was greater than ordinary wolves, yet their bond with a warg could last decades. They were, in a very real sense, extensions of their bonded human living weapons and scouts and companions, rolled into one breathing, running creature. Here is something crucial to understand about all of this. These abilities, greensight, warging, the deep bone connection to the old gods and the weirwood network, did not appear spontaneously in the first men who later settled in Westeros. They came from contact with the children. They were, in a sense, a gift, or perhaps more accurately, a bleed, an inheritance picked up through thousands of years of proximity and, in certain cases, through far more deliberate forms of transmission. The children carved their gods' faces into every weirwood tree on an island at the center of a great lake called the God's Eye, according to legend, and so that the gods themselves could watch the great peace agreement that would eventually be made. Every tree on that island, every single one, bore a face. The children believed that the old gods watched through those faces. And if the old gods were, in truth, the collected consciousness of every Green Seer who had ever lived, absorbed into the weirwood network at death, which is the most plausible interpretation of what the texts suggest, then the children were not just worshipping abstract gods. They were worshipping themselves, their ancestors, their remembered dead. The great wisdom of every generation compressed into wood and root and sap. There is something deeply important in the nature of the weirwood network, that most people overlook when they are focused on the drama of armies and dragons and political intrigue. Yet the network is not simply a communication system, not simply a surveillance tool that lets a greenseer see what is happening in a distant location. It is a living archive of everything that has ever been seen through any weirwood eye. The memories stored in those roots do not degrade or fade the way human memory does. They persist. The death of a greenseer does not erase what they knew, because what they knew has been absorbed into the wood, into the chemical memory of an organism that can live for thousands of years without dying, that spreads its roots beneath the surface in ways that connect different trees across enormous distances. When Bran Stark looks through the weirwood network in his most powerful visions, he is not accessing recorded images like some magical version of a video camera. He is touching a living consciousness that has been continuously watching and accumulating and storing for longer than human civilization has existed. He sees Ned Stark practicing swordplay in the courtyard of Winterfell as a teenager. He sees further back than that. He sees things that happened before any human had a name or a language. The oldest memories in those roots go back to the Dawn Age itself, to the moment when the first weirwood face was carved, and the first eye opened, and the first consciousness was poured in, and the world began to remember itself. This is the world the first men arrived in. Not an empty wilderness, but a living, watching, breathing magical landscape, governed by beings who had been there since before memory had a beginning. And the first men, yet crossing the land bridge that then connected Essos to Westeros at the place that would later become Dorne, carrying bronze weapons and horses and fire, looked at this world and did what invaders do. They began to take it apart. They cut down the weirwood trees, not out of particular malice, but because they needed timber, because the trees were valuable, because nobody told them what those trees meant. To the children, every felled weirwood was an act of desecration, a destruction not just of sacred wood, but of the memories stored within it, of the consciousness that lived in the roots. The children struck back. They used their magic to try to stop the invasion, summoning floods, calling down what the old stories describe as the Hammer of the Waters, breaking apart the land bridge behind the first men so that no more could follow. Wat the Neck, that strange boggy region that separates the north from the rest of Westeros, exists today because of what the children did there, pouring water magic into the land to stop an unstoppable enemy. For approximately 2,000 years, by the reckoning of scholars who have puzzled over fragmentary ancient sources, the children of the forest and the first men were locked in a war of attrition. The first men had superior weapons of bronze and later iron, greater numbers, horses, and no particular connection to the magic of this land. The children had sorcery, intimate knowledge of every inch of the forest, and the ability to call on animals as allies. Neither side could decisively defeat the other. And as the centuries ground on, that very stalemate began to shift something. Because people who have fought each other for long enough begin to understand each other, begin sometimes to respect each other, begin to realize in the quiet moments between battles that they share the same need for water and warmth and rest, that their grief looks the same even if their faces do not. The pact was the result. It was signed on the Isle of Faces, in the middle of the God's Eye Lake, watched by every carved weirwood face on that island. The terms were essentially territorial. The first men would take the open lands, the coasts, the plains. The children would keep the deep forests. No more weirwoods would be cut. The magical creatures of the wilderness, the direwolves, the giants, the others that still roamed those ancient places, would be respected, and crucially, the first men agreed to adopt the gods of the children, to worship at the weirwood trees, to speak their prayers to the old gods. This was not merely a religious concession. This was, whether the first men fully understood it or not, an integration. By praying at the weirwoods, by pouring their thoughts and grief and gratitude into the listening faces of those trees, the first men began to feed the same network the children had used for millennia. Their memories began to enter the wood. Their voices began to join the chorus. The wall between what the children were and what the first men were began to blur, slowly at first. Then, over generations, more decisively. The bloodlines mingled too, though the texts are vague about this in ways that feel deliberate. What is clear is that by the Age of Heroes, the period that followed the Pact, certain First Men families, particularly those in the far north, who had lived closest to the children for the longest time, were displaying abilities that should have been impossible. They were warging. They were dreaming green dreams. They were inheriting, through blood and proximity and 1,000 years of prayer poured into listening wood, something that had once belonged only to the children. And among those families, in that cold northern place where the forests were most ancient and the connection to the old magic most deeply rooted, one lineage was rising towards something that nobody yet had a name for. The house that would become the Starks was being born. Just part 2, 2,000 years of war and the people who survived it. The first men who pushed into the north and stayed there were a different kind of people than those who settled the warmer southern lands. The south was kinder. The climate was forgiving. A man could afford to be comfortable in the south, to build pretty things, to worry about politics and trade routes and the artful arrangement of painted tiles in his garden. The north was nothing like that. The north was the kind of place that killed careless people. The winters came long and bitter, and the summers could be deceptively short. The forests in those latitudes were ancient and dense, the kind of places where things moved between the trees that did not show themselves in daylight, and where the dire wolves ran in packs through the snow and the mammoths still moved in great slow herds across the frozen highlands. The men and women who settled there and chose to stay were selecting, generation by generation, for a particular kind of strength. Not the glamorous strength of warriors trained in warm castles and fed on rich food. Something quieter, more enduring. The strength of people who have looked at a place that could kill them and said, "All right, I will learn the rules of this place, and I will outlast it." And they did, slowly, learn the rules, including some rules that those southern settlers never managed to absorb. Because the north was where the children of the forest maintained their deepest presence, even as their overall numbers began to thin. The great weirwood groves in the north had not been cut. Yet the old practices survived. The old language, the true tongue of the children, which scholars agree was entirely unlike any human speech, was taught to certain northern leaders, learned painstakingly, because knowing it was the difference between peace and conflict with the beings who still moved in the deep forest places. There is a figure in the lore of the North called the Warg King, mentioned only obliquely in the oldest texts preserved at the Night's Watch archives, who may tell us something important about how the Stark bloodline acquired its most distinctive qualities. The Warg King was a ruler of Sea Dragon Point, the northwestern peninsula jutting into the Sunset Sea. He commanded an army that included Greenseers, and he was allied with the Children of the Forest. He was eventually defeated by the Stark Kings, who were consolidating power in the north, the Kings of Winter, as they were known in those days. And his male heirs were put to the sword, but his daughters were taken as prisoners and, according to the oldest accounts, some of them were taken as wives by the Stark Kings. This is not a romantic detail. This is a lore detail of enormous significance. The Warg King's daughters carried within them whatever bloodline combination had produced greensight and warding abilities, a mix of First Men ancestry and something absorbed from generations of proximity to and alliance with the children. By marrying those daughters into the Stark bloodline, the Kings of Winter were not just absorbing defeated rivals, they were absorbing a magical inheritance. Yet they were combining whatever they already had, which appears to have been considerable, given the Stark family's own long ties to the weirwood at Winterfell, with something that made the resulting lineage distinctly unusual. Every Stark child with the gift, every direwolf bond that runs deeper than trainer and pet, every green dream that visits a sleeping Stark with images they have no rational explanation for. These abilities trace back to that absorption and all that came before it. Thousands of years of a single family maintaining the oldest religious practices on the continent. Thousands of years of a single family sitting in prayer at the heart tree in Winterfell's Godswood, feeding their consciousness into the roots of a weirwood that still stands there, old and white-barked and watching, in the present day of the story. Because here is the thing about the weirwood trees and the memories they hold. Old Nan, the ancient storyteller and caretaker of the Stark children in Winterfell, once told Bran something that sounds like a grandmother's fancy, but turns out to be one of the most profound truths in the entire mythology of the world. She told him that the Heart Tree had seen Bran the Builder set the first stone of Winterfell, if the old tales were true. The Heart Tree had been there from the very beginning. Whatever was stored in its wood, whatever memories and voices it had absorbed through thousands of years of Stark prayers and Stark grief and Stark joy, it held all of that. Every Stark who had ever knelt in that Godswood and opened their mind to the listening trees had put something of themselves there. In a very real sense, In Winterfell's heart tree was a library of the Stark bloodline itself. And now we approach something that the show and the books both gesture toward, but never fully state. The possibility that the Starks were not simply first men who happened to live near the old magic. They may have been, in some deep biological and spiritual sense, the most thoroughly transformed first men on the continent. The human family most thoroughly integrated with the ancient network of the Children of the Forest. The family in whom the boundary between man and the old magic had become thinner than anywhere else. Which makes what comes next, the desperate, catastrophic decision the Children of the Forest made in the depths of their war with the First Men, more than a little ironic. Because when the children looked around for a human whose blood and spirit might be the most powerful possible raw material for an act of dark magic, beyond anything they had attempted before, the most obvious candidate would have been a man of the North, a man from the lineage that would become the Starks. The children wanted to create a weapon. What they got instead was the end of the world. Part 3. The Darkest Experiment. The Birth of the Night King. The war between the First Men and the Children of the Forest had ground on for approximately 2,000 years before the pact ended it. But the texts that describe this history, fragmentary, translated through multiple languages and perspectives, written down thousands of years after the events they describe, do not give a clean linear timeline. The pact was not a single moment. It was a process. And somewhere in the years before the peace was formalized, when the children were fighting most desperately, when the bronze weapons of the First Men were beginning to erode the forests faster than the children's magic could defend them, someone among the greenseers of the children made a decision. We see this decision in Bran Stark's vision. He watches through the green sight, through his connection to the weirwood network, and he sees a clearing in the haunted forest. There is a great weirwood tree, ancient and massive. Its bark is white as bone, its carved face watching with blank patience. And tied to that tree is a man, a human man, a first man, naked and cold, his wrists bound to the wood, his face carrying the particular blankness of someone who has moved beyond fear into a kind of terrible resignation. As standing before him is one of the children, a small leaf-garbed figure with enormous golden eyes. The child's name, as much as any of the children had names the way humans understood names, is Leaf, and in Leaf's hands is a shard of dragon glass, obsidian. The volcanic glass that the children have always used for weapons, that the First Men quickly learned could kill things that bronze could not. Leaf drives that shard into the man's chest, into his heart, and his eyes turn blue. Not the pale blue of a clear winter sky, not the faded blue of an old man's eyes, the deep burning, unnatural blue that will later be called ice fire by the people unlucky enough to see it. The blue that does not reflect light, but seems to generate it from within, cold and absolute. Yet the blue of something that has stopped being human and become something else entirely. The man who was tied to that weirwood tree became the Night King, the first White Walker, the original experiment. Think carefully about what this means. The Children of the Forest, the creators of the magic that underpins almost everything sacred and protective in the story of Westeros, created the very thing that nearly destroyed the world. They didn't discover the Night King. They didn't accidentally unleash him from some primordial darkness. They built him, deliberately, with their own hands, with the volcanic glass that is, ironically, one of the very few substances capable of killing the monsters they created. The logic makes terrible sense in context. The children were losing, not immediately, not catastrophically, but inexorably. Yes, the First Men had numbers and metal, and were breeding faster than the forest could absorb them. Every generation there were more humans and fewer trees. The children's magic was profound but not infinite, and it was tied to the natural world in ways that made it vulnerable to exactly the kind of systematic destruction the First Men were conducting. Cut down the weirwoods, and the children lost their eyes and their memories. Kill enough of the children themselves, and the Greenseer network grew thinner and quieter. The First Men were winning a war of attrition they may not even have fully realized they were fighting. So, the children's Greenseers, or at least a faction of them, because it strains belief that every child agreed to this, did what desperate people do when conventional methods have failed. Yes, they reached further than anyone had ever reached before. They took one of the invaders, a specific man, chosen for reasons the text does not clearly state, though the evidence we will discuss shortly suggests his blood was distinctive, that there was something about who he was that made the magic possible in the way it was needed. and they transformed him. The dragonglass shard driven into a human heart is not simply a wound. It is a transformation, a rewriting. Something in the volcanic glass interacts with the human body in a way that alters it at the most fundamental level, replacing the warmth of life with something colder, slower, more patient. The body that was human became inhuman. The mind that was human became something else, something that retained enough of its previous self to be intelligent, strategic, as capable of purpose and plan, but which had shed whatever it was that made a person identifiable as part of the living world. The eyes that turn blue are not just a cosmetic change. They are the outward sign that whatever looks out from behind them is no longer the same kind of thing that looked out from behind them before. And then the children discovered what they had actually made. The original theory was presumably that the Night King would be a weapon they controlled, a powerful being bound to their purposes by the magic of his creation, someone who would fight against the first men at their direction. Creatures turned by children magic, serving children purposes, a supernatural soldier in their supernatural war. This plan, if it was ever truly coherent, lasted approximately as long as plans made in desperation usually last. Because the Night King was not controlled, the Night King was free. He turned, not against the children alone, but against everything, against all life, against the warmth of the world, against the summer and the green things and the breathing, bleeding creatures that filled the forests and the plains. He became, in a phrase the texts return to again and again, something ancient and implacable, something that had never existed before, and that the world had no defenses against, because the world had not known to build any. And he made more of his kind. The specific mechanics of how the Night King created new White Walkers are something Westeros historians have debated for generations, partly because the information was suppressed, and partly because so few people survived the Long Night with any ability to analyze what had happened. And what we know, confirmed most directly by what we see in the show, is that the Night King could transform human infants into White Walkers through a touch. A single finger pressed to a tiny cheek, and the warmth drains away. The eyes shift to that impossible blue, and something that was a child becomes a soldier for the army of the dead. The transformation required an infant, specifically, not an adult, not someone who had lived long enough to accumulate the kind of self that might resist the change. Infants, new and unmade, could be remade entirely. The implication of Craster's arrangement, which we will discuss in full when we reach the later period of the story, is that this practice of infant transformation was how the White Walker numbers grew, slowly but steadily, over the years of their existence. Each White Walker was a former human. Each White Walker had once been something warm and small and innocent. The army of ice and death was built out of human babies, transformed into soldiers for a war against the living world that no one had wanted and no one knew how to stop. What happened to the children when they realized what they had done? The texts go quiet here, as texts tend to do when the subject is too painful or too damning to record clearly. We know the children eventually allied with the first men against the White Walkers. We know the pact was reached. We know that even as the long night was falling, even as the world was going dark, the children chose the side of the living world against the thing they had made. Leaf, the same child who drove the dragonglass into the man who became the Night King, who later died in Bran Stark's time fighting White Walkers with fire, throwing explosive magic at the Whites to protect the people she had chosen to help. Whether she was the same Leaf, whether the children live long enough for that kind of continuity, is debated. But the poetry is there regardless. The child who created the greatest threat to life also chose to spend whatever remained of her existence fighting it. This too is a very Westerosi kind of tragedy. Part 4. The Long Night. When the sun forgot to rise, the long night. 2 words that carry the weight of 8,000 years. Every fire that a northerner lights in winter. Every corpse that the people of the north burn rather than bury. An ancient practice that persists into the present day because they still remember, in the marrow of their bones, if not in conscious thought, is that bodies left unburned can rise and walk and kill. Every time a mother in the north wraps her child more tightly and feels something she cannot name, a cold that does not come from the wind, but from some older place, she is feeling the echo of the long night. According to the oldest legends, it began with a winter that did not end. Not a long winter of the kind Westeros experiences regularly, those years-long cold spells that form the normal rhythm of seasons in that world. Something categorically different. A winter that ate through one year and then another and did not slow, did not show any sign of the gradual warming that eventually brings the thaw. People were born during the long night who never saw the sun. People lived their entire lives in a darkness and a cold that they had no framework for understanding. Yet because nothing in the history of their people prepared them for a winter that lasted for a generation. And in that darkness, the White Walkers moved south. The stories about them are filtered through so many retellings that it is hard to separate the historical reality from the mythology, but certain consistent elements appear across every version. Old Nan, who told her stories to the Stark children in Winterfell, and who seemed to have a direct line to some very old knowledge, described them like this: cold things in the darkness, with eyes like blue stars, riding dead horses, and walking beside giant ice spiders big as hounds. They came out of the uttermost north, out of that permanently frozen wasteland, beyond even the furthest extent of the forests where nothing grew and nothing warm could survive. Yet the place that would eventually be called the land of always winter, they killed the living, they raised the dead. Every person who fell to a White Walker or to the army of whites they commanded rose again, not to the life they had before, but to a cold mockery of it, empty eyes open, moving at the direction of the Night King and his lieutenants. The army grew every time it killed, which meant that the longer the war lasted, the more overwhelming the enemy became. Every Westerosi soldier who fell in battle increased the size of the force they had been fighting against. It was a nightmare logic that made conventional military thinking useless. You could not simply defeat an army in the field because defeat fed the enemy. The legends mention the last hero. This figure appears across different northern traditions in different forms, is carrying different names, given different attributes in different retellings. In Essos, in the far eastern lands around Ashai and the Shadow, the same period is associated with a hero called Azor Ahai, who forged a sword of living flame called Lightbringer. To make this sword, according to those traditions, Azor Ahai had to sacrifice what he loved most in the world, plunging the still incomplete blade into the heart of his wife, Nissa, so that her life and her love and her soul became the fire that lived in the steel. The sword that was born from that sacrifice, Lightbringer, could harm the White Walkers in ways conventional weapons could not. Whether Azor Ahai and the last hero of Westerosi legend are the same person, or two different heroes in two different places who both face the long night, this is something scholars argue about endlessly. What seems clear is that the world was dark and cold and dying, and more than one desperate person rose to fight the dying, whether through the sacrifice and creation of Lightbringer, or through the discovery that dragonglass, the same volcanic glass the children of the forest had used to create the very first White Walker, could kill White Walkers when driven into them, or through some combination of these and other tactics that the legends have not fully preserved. The living pushed back. The battle for the dawn. It happened, it was real. We know this not because the histories are clear, they are not, because this was a world before writing in the conventional sense. And in everything that has come down to us passed through hundreds of years of oral tradition before anyone thought to chisel it into records. But because the physical evidence is impossible to dispute, the wall exists. It was built after the long night ended, and its very existence proves that the people who built it believed they had won a war and needed a permanent barrier to prevent the defeated enemy from returning. You do not build a structure 700 feet high and 300 miles long as a decorative gesture. The wall was built by people who were terrified of what they had survived and determined that it would never happen again. And critically, the battle for the dawn apparently unified the peoples of the North in a way that directly led to the rise of House Stark. The oldest texts connect the founding of Winterfell and the establishment of the Kings of Winter very precisely to the period immediately following the defeat of the White Walkers. Someone, in the aftermath of that great victory, gathered the fractured northern clans and northern families under a single banner and built the first permanent seat of northern Purs on the hill above the hot springs in a place that had, apparently, already been significant for generations. That builder, that founder, was Bran the Builder, and Bran the Builder was a Stark. Part 5. Bran the Builder, the Wall, Winterfell, and a covenant written in stone. The name Bran has a particular resonance in the Stark family. It is one of the most common names given to Stark children across the thousands of years of that house's history. Yet the present-day Bran Stark is not the only Bran. There is Brandon the Builder, who is the legendary founder. There are Brandons in the middle generations. The name recurs with a frequency that feels almost ritualistic, as though each generation names a child Bran in the hope or expectation that this particular child will be the one who inherits whatever it was that made the first Bran extraordinary. Brandon the Builder is described as one of the foundational figures of the Age of Heroes, a legendary period that followed the Pact and the eventual victory over the White Walkers. He is credited with an astonishing number of architectural achievements: Storm's End in the south, the High Tower in Old Town, and of course, the Wall in Winterfell in the north. Scholars argue about whether one man could truly have accomplished all of this. Yet whether perhaps the name Brandon the Builder has become a kind of historical shorthand for several different builders across several different generations, their achievements collapsed into a single legendary figure the way myths tend to do. George R. R. Martin himself has noted that Bran the Builder is as remote from the present of the story as Noah and Gilgamesh are from our own time. But the core tradition is consistent. A Stark, the first Stark or close to it, raised the wall after the long night, with the help of giants and the magic of the children of the forest. Consider the wall as a physical object for a moment. 700 feet tall, 300 miles wide, spanning the entire northern edge of the continent from the gorge to the shivering sea. It cutting off the lands of men from whatever lies beyond with an absoluteness that has no practical precedent anywhere in the world. No natural formation could have produced it. No purely human effort of muscle and sweat and timber scaffolding could have raised blocks of ice that large to that height. Accounts from various traditions agree that giants hauled those blocks into place. The enormous creatures that still existed in greater numbers in that period, and who, despite their intelligence, had reason to help with any project that protected the living world against the dead. And the children of the forest used their magic on the wall as it was built, weaving something into the ice itself that went beyond the physical barrier. Bran the Builder learned the true tongue of the children to negotiate this collaboration. Well, think about what that means. The true tongue, the language of the children, which sounds to human ears like nothing remotely human, is not something a person picks up casually. It requires an unusual mind, unusual magical sensitivity, and presumably a trust on the children's part that this specific human was worth teaching. The fact that Brandon was able to learn it, and that the children were willing to teach him, speaks to a relationship between this founder of House Stark and the ancient beings of the forest that went far beyond simple alliance of convenience. The children's magic in the wall was specifically designed to stop the dead from crossing. The Whites, the White Walkers themselves, something in the enchantment of the wall turned them back. They could not pass. For 8,000 years, whatever was in that ice held. And 8,000 years is not a short test of a piece of spellwork. It held through every political upheaval, every change of dynasty, every generation that forgot what it was even guarding against. It held until the Night King himself flew over it on a resurrected dragon, bypassing rather than breaking through it, which is arguably a testament to its effectiveness rather than evidence of its failure. Now consider Winterfell, built by the same hands with the same help at approximately the same time. Built above a network of natural hot springs that keep the stones warm even in the deepest winters, in a way that visitors from the south always find slightly uncanny. Winterfell is warm when it should be cold. Something in its foundations retains heat through mechanisms that go beyond mere geology. And deep beneath the castle, and older than the walls above, older than anything that can be reliably dated, is the crypt. The crypt of Winterfell is enormous, not just in the number of its chambers but in its vertical depth. There are multiple levels going down and down into the earth beneath the castle, and the lowest levels are partly collapsed, meaning no one living in the present day has fully explored them. Each level holds the stone statues of dead Starks, seated with iron swords across their laps, and stone direwolves at their feet. The custom of the iron swords is explained in the texts with a phrase that is passed off as superstition, to keep the vengeful spirits in their crypts. But in a world where the dead can and do rise and walk, this is not superstition. This is a security measure. The iron keeps the dead quiet. And an ancient custom holds that only Starks may enter the crypts, a rule enforced for generations with a seriousness that goes far beyond mere family pride. Why only Starks? What would happen if someone else entered? The The most compelling answer, and the one that explains the strange perpetual chill in the crypts despite the hot springs warming the castle above, is that something was sealed there at the founding. Something that requires the magic of the Stark bloodline, the same Greenseer adjacent magic that runs through their family, the same deep connection to the Weirwood network, to keep contained. The saying there must always be a Stark in Winterfell is not a sentiment of attachment or pride. It is an instruction, a maintenance requirement, a warning about what happens if the seal weakens, the great ice cold in the crypts, the iron swords that have been rusting away over the millennia, the old rule that forbids outsiders from descending, the deliberate placement of the castle's founding on this exact spot, above these exact springs, in this exact arrangement. Everything about Winterfell suggests that it was built not just as a home, but as a lock. The wall was built to keep something out. Winterfell may have been built to keep something in, whether that something is the Night's Queen of the old legend, a defeated creature of ice sealed away in the deepest chamber, or the Great Other, the opposing force to the Lord of Light in that theological framework, or something else entirely, something that the texts do not have words for because it predates the vocabulary of the world's religions, is one of the great unanswered questions. But the pattern is too persistent, too specific to be coincidence. Bran the Builder, in the aftermath of the Long Night, understood something about the nature of the threat he had helped defeat, something that made him choose this specific location for the family seat, something that made him weave the same children's magic into the foundations of his home that he wove into the wall, and something that made him name his family with a name and a motto that would serve through thousands of years of comfort and forgetting as a reminder. Winter is coming, not a description of seasonal weather, a warning, a reminder of what had happened and what could happen again. Something pressed into the identity of a family so thoroughly that they would still be saying it, still believing it in their bones if not their conscious minds. Our 8,000 years later, sitting in their warm great hall while the southern lords mocked their northern seriousness and called them too grim, too cold, too serious about a world that had long since moved on. The Starks never moved on. They could not. They were the lock, and the lock had to stay in place. Part 6, The Night's King. When a Stark became the enemy, it is Old Nan who tells the story best. It is always Old Nan. Mira, Jojen, Hodor, and Bran shelter from the dark at the Night Fort, the oldest and most storied of the castles built into the wall. And Bran remembers the stories Old Nan told him when he was small and soft and still had the use of his legs. The stories she told in winter, by firelight, to children who were supposed to be frightened into sleeping rather than lying awake imagining the things in the dark. Old Nan's stories never made children sleep comfortably. Old Nan's stories had a way of being just a little too specific, just a little too detailed for comfortable dismissal as imagination. The Night's King, she said, was the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. This matters for dating purposes. If Jon Snow is the 998th Lord Commander, and if the Night's Watch was founded immediately after the wall was built, at the end of the Long Night approximately 8,000 years before the present day of the story, then the 13th commander would have served within the first few hundred years of the wall's existence. The foundations of the order would still have been fresh. The people who built the wall might still have been alive, or at least their children. The memory of what the wall was for would have been vivid and recent. This particular Lord Commander, the 13th, was known for being fearless. Old Nan always said this was his greatest virtue and his fatal flaw, because all men must know fear. And a man who knows no fear is a man who has not yet understood the world clearly enough to recognize the things he should be afraid of. He was the best warrior the Watch had at that time, according to the legend. He had led successful rangings into the haunted forest beyond the wall. He had fought things in the dark and come back alive when others had not. Then one night, standing watch on top of the wall, he saw her, a woman in the forest below, with skin white as the moon, hair as silver as starlight, and eyes like blue stars. Not the blue of sky or sea, but the deep, burning blue that means only one thing in the mythology of Westeros. She was cold. She was a creature of ice. She was, in every description that has come down to us, a White Walker, a female White Walker, which the stories call a corpse queen or his ice bride, phrases that carry an unmistakable horror, even filtered through centuries of retelling. He climbed down from the wall. He chased her. The legend says that when he found her, when he took her in his arms, her cold touch reached into him and took hold of something. When he gave his seed to her, he gave his soul. The old phrase sounds medieval, sounds like the kind of morality story that religious traditions use to warn young men about women. But in this context, it means something more literal. The White Walker woman bound him, not through seduction alone, through magic, through the kind of bone-deep enchantment that the Night King himself was created through. She put something into him that was cold and old and incompatible with the warmth of the living world. He brought her back, through the wall somehow, a detail that the texts glide past in a way that suggests either that the wall's protections were not yet fully in place, or that a Lord Commander with the right words and the right blood could open it, or that the legend has been simplified from something more complicated. He brought her to the Night Fort, the greatest castle on the wall, and he declared himself the Night's King. He declared her his queen. And through sorcery, the specific nature of which is not described, perhaps not recordable, perhaps belonging to the category of things people will not speak, he bound the brothers of the Night's Watch to his will. For 13 years, the Night's King ruled the wall. See, he made human sacrifices. To what? The texts are deliberately vague. The others is the phrase that appears, which in the context of the story means the White Walkers. For 13 years, the living dead had an agent inside the wall, feeding them and serving them from within the very institution that existed to protect the living world from them. The wall did not stop the long night. The Night's King almost reopened it from within. What ended his reign was an alliance that, to anyone paying attention to the patterns of this history, has a familiar shape. The free folk, the wildlings, the people who lived north of the wall and who have always maintained a different and more immediate relationship with the reality of what lies beyond it than the comfortable southerners, united under a king beyond the wall. And this king reached across the wall to the King of Winter, the Stark who held Winterfell in that generation. And together they marched on the Night Fort, and they brought the Night's King down. His name was erased afterward. Every record of his reign was destroyed. The Night's Watch was forbidden from speaking of him, under threat of punishment so severe that the prohibition survived for thousands of years. The Stark king who defeated him, Brandon the Breaker, was credited with this erasure. He wanted the Night's King forgotten so completely that even his name would be lost. And here is the detail that old Nan always saved for last, pressing her finger to little Bran's nose in that dark, fire-lit way of hers. She said she knew a version of the tale, the true version, where the Night's King was a Stark, full brother to the king who brought him down, maybe even named Brandon, like Bran himself. She said he might have slept in Bran's very bedroom. Think about that. A Stark becomes the Night's King. A Stark brings him down. The person who created the greatest internal threat to the Wall's mission, and the person who ended that threat were brothers. Possibly brothers with the same name. The same bloodline that built the Wall and built Winterfell also produced the man who nearly destroyed everything those buildings were meant to protect. Why is this not merely an awkward family history, but something deeply significant? Because it illuminates something about the Stark magic that we have been slowly building toward. The connection between Starks and the cold. Between the Stark bloodline and the Weirwood network, and the old gods and the ancient magic of the North. This connection is not a purely benign thing. It is not simply a family gift, a nice ability to bond with wolves and have prophetic dreams. It is a connection to something very old and very powerful and double-edged. Something that can manifest as the warm light of a green seer looking through the past to understand the present, or as the cold hunger of a man whose soul has been taken by a creature of ice. The Stark blood is, apparently, susceptible to something that other bloodlines are not. The Night's King of the legend was not just any Lord Commander. He was a Stark. Whatever his Ice Bride did to him, she could do to him because of what he was. Because his particular blood, his particular connection to the ancient magical network of the North, made him capable of being bound in a way that a Bolton or a Lannister or a Florin could not have been bound in the same way. The same qualities that made the Stark Green Seers extraordinary, the thinness of the boundary between their minds and the Weirwood network, the ease with which their consciousness could flow outward beyond the limits of their bodies, made the Night's King vulnerable to a transformation that turned all of that outward-flowing magic cold. The Starks and the White Walkers are not simply enemies who happen to live close to each other. They share a root. They come from the same place. The White Walkers were made from First Men blood, most likely with a particular quality of First Men blood. And the Starks are the most magically significant First Men on the continent. The Night's King story, buried under layers of deliberate erasure, is the most explicit expression of what happens when that shared root asserts itself in the wrong direction. Bran the Breaker destroyed all the records. He erased the name. He made it forbidden to speak it. And then, quietly, his family continued to hold Winterfell, continued to sit in the Godswood, continued to pray at the Weirwood, continued to name their children Brandon, as if they were keeping a memorial, as if they wanted to remember, even when the specific memory was forbidden. As if the motto "Winter is coming" was not just a warning about the seasons, but a reminder. This has happened before, in our own family, and we must not let it happen again. Idiot Part 7, 8,000 Years of Silence. What was happening? While no one was looking, the long night ended. The wall went up. The Night's Watch was founded. The Night's King fell. And then, nothing, or nothing obvious. For approximately 8,000 years between the end of the Long Night and the return of the White Walkers at the beginning of Game of Thrones, the others, as the books call them, were not seen, not once, not a single confirmed sighting. The great threat that had nearly extinguished all life in the world simply vanished, retreating back to the land of always winter, and stayed there. What does an 8,000-year absence mean? The most common interpretation, the one that dominated Southern thinking and eventually became the official position of learned men everywhere south of the Neck, was that the White Walkers had never existed, that the Long Night was a myth, an exaggerated folk memory of a particularly bad winter, that the army of the dead was the invention of frightened people looking for explanations for natural disasters, that Old Nan's stories were exactly what Maester Luwin told Bran they were, tales for children, with no more historical basis than nursery rhymes. When the Andals came to Westeros and cut down the Weirwoods and brought their faith of the Seven, the very memory of the others became associated with the old, backward beliefs of the North that enlightened Southerners were supposed to have moved beyond. But absence is not the same as non-existence. The White Walkers during those 8,000 years were not dead, not dormant in any simple sense. They were waiting, in the deep cold of the land of always winter, and slowly preparing. Because the show makes clear that the Night King had a plan, a specific plan with specific targets, and plans require time to develop. He needed numbers. The transformation of human infants into White Walkers was slow, requiring a steady supply of the right kind of sacrifice. And in the ordinary course of events, beyond the wall, there was no steady supply. The wildlings, the descendants of the first men who chose to stay north of the wall when it was built, had no reason to offer their children. They would never have agreed. Their relationship with the White Walkers was one of terror and flight and desperate survival. Except for one man, one wildling living in a fortified homestead called Craster's Keep, deep in the haunted forest. His name was Craster, and he had made an arrangement. Craster was the product of an incestuous relationship, fathered by a man of the Night's Watch on one of his own daughters. He was, in other words, someone who had no loyalty to either the world of the Watch or the world of ordinary wildling society. He existed in a strange interstitial space, acknowledged by neither and using both. He had wives, his own daughters, who bore him more daughters, who became wives in turn, a cycle of incestuous reproduction that the Night's Watch Rangers who used his keep as a shelter found nauseating, but tolerated because Craster was one of their only reliable sources of information and refuge beyond the wall. Craster was also the only wildling in living memory whose homestead the White Walkers consistently passed by without touching. And every other free folk settlement north of the wall had been raided, abandoned, or destroyed in the years leading up to the main story. Craster's Keep stood. The reason was his sons. Every male child born at Craster's Keep was taken into the forest and left as an offering. Craster called the White Walkers his gods. His wives, speaking in hushed voices that suggested they were afraid of being overheard, called them the cold gods too, and they knew, even without confirming details, what happened to the sons. They became the brothers, the wives said. Craster's sons were turned into new White Walkers by the Night King's touch. This is confirmed directly in the show when we see the Night King transform Craster's last son at the altar in the land of always winter. This arrangement had apparently gone on for decades, possibly much longer. And Craster's mother had been a daughter of a Night's Watch man, suggesting that some version of this relationship between the keep and the beings in the north had roots going back further than Craster himself. The White Walkers received a slow, steady trickle of human infants, perfectly suitable for transformation, in exchange for leaving one man's household untouched. It was, in its own horrible way, a testament to the White Walkers' capacity for strategic patience. 8,000 years is a long time to wait. A few decades of steady infant sacrifices from a single cooperative wildling is a small, manageable investment toward an eventual goal. What was the goal? The show makes it clearest through the Night King's actions and the three-eyed raven's urgency. The Night King wanted Bran Stark. Specifically the Bran Stark who had become the three-eyed raven, the living human who had the most complete access to the Weirwood network, who could see through any Weirwood anywhere in the world and in any era of history. Killing the three-eyed raven was not simply about eliminating a dangerous opponent. The three-eyed raven, as an entity, is described as something like a human memory of the world, an archive, a recorder, a living repository of everything that had ever been seen and stored in the Weirwood trees. Killing Bran in his role as three-eyed raven would be like burning a library, not just any library, but the library that contains every record of every event in the history of the world. An endless night has no meaning if somewhere, in a tree, there is a record of what came before. If someone can look through the Weirwood eyes and see that there was once a sun, once a summer, once a world full of warmth and living things, the Night King wanted to erase that. He wanted the darkness to be total, permanent, and unremembered. And to do that, he needed to reach Bran. And Bran was a Stark, in Winterfell, at the Heart Tree, exactly where the original magic had been planted, 8,000 years before, by the man who built both the wall and the Stark family seat. It converges. It all converges. Part 8. The Return. Winter comes for real for the people of Westeros. At the beginning of the story, the White Walkers were exactly what Maester Luwin told Bran they were. Stories. Not even particularly frightening stories to adult ears. The kind of thing that belonged in the same category as giant spiders and ice dragons. Wonderful for giving children nightmares, but utterly unconnected to the serious world of politics and lineage, and who sat on the Iron Throne. When a deserter from the Night's Watch named Will was brought before Ned Stark in the very first scene of Game of Thrones, raving about having encountered White Walkers beyond the wall, Ned's response was not to investigate but to execute the man for desertion. A good Stark, a lawful Stark, following the rules exactly as they had been laid down, and being entirely wrong. But the North knew, even when it could not say it clearly. The Night's Watch had been deteriorating for generations, as the lordly families who were supposed to send second sons to man the wall instead sent criminals and unwanted bastards and disgraced knights. The Watch had gone from something like a sacred order to something like a garbage dump for people that polite society preferred not to think about. In a more cynical era, a time without living memory of why the wall existed, the Watch seemed like a pointless institution. The wildlings could be managed. The cold was manageable. Nothing had attacked from beyond the wall in 8,000 years. Why maintain something so expensive for something so theoretical? And then the White Walkers moved south, not all at once. First came the coldness pushing ahead of them, winter arriving earlier than it should, lasting longer than it should. And then came the disappearances. Night's Watch Rangers who went beyond the wall and did not come back. Then came the reports that no one in the south believed, the insistent, increasingly desperate messages from the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, that something was happening beyond the wall, something real, something ancient and terrible and moving. The White Walker reemergence was not impulsive. It had been planned. The Night King had watched through the Weirwood network. He had marked Bran Stark, physically touching him during a vision, and leaving a mark that the children's magic in the three-eyed raven's cave could no longer hide. And he had assembled his army with the patience of 8,000 years. When he finally moved, he moved with everything. His generals, the army of whites, tens of thousands of the risen dead. And Craster's sons, now grown, now the 13 White Walkers who stood in the circle at the ice altar when the last of the sacrificed infants was transformed. The leadership of an undead empire, built from human babies over decades of a one-man wildling's dark covenant. The pattern of where he chose to strike next reveals his strategy clearly. He did not simply march south, killing everything. He went to Hardhome first. the great wildling settlement where thousands of free folk had gathered, the largest concentration of living humans beyond the wall. The massacre at Hardhome was strategic. He was not just killing, he was building his army to a size that could overwhelm any conventional military force. He raised the dead of Hardhome in full view of Jon Snow, the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, because he could. Because no sword Jon carried could stop him from doing it. Because he wanted Jon, and through Jon the rest of the living world, to understand the scope of what was coming. He held Jon's gaze as the boats pulled away, and he lifted his arms, and thousands of Hardhome's newly dead opened their blue eyes and stood up. Then he turned Viserion, a dragon, Daenerys Targaryen's dragon, killed above the frozen lake when Jon Snow's reckless mission north went catastrophically wrong and the Night King threw an ice spear from the shore with perfect accuracy. That dragon died and fell through the ice and was pulled up somehow. The show doesn't explain exactly how. And the Night King's touch turned it into something that breathed blue fire instead of gold and orange. Not the fire of summer, but the fire of cold space. The fire that does not warm, but destroys. He used that dragon to bring down the wall. 8,000 years of Bran the Builder's architecture, brought down in minutes. The magic in the ice could hold against the Whites and the White Walkers themselves. But something had changed. Something had been broken before the wall fell. Some scholars believe it was the fact that Bran had passed through the wall while marked by the Night King, that the mark created a passage through the enchantment that the Night King could follow. And the blue fire found the weakness and the wall came apart. He marched south, to Winterfell, to Bran. Part 9. The Starks and the Endgame. 3 instruments of a single purpose. In the final chapters of the White Walker story, as the show tells it, 3 Starks stand between the Night King and his victory. And they stand there not by accident, not because geography put them in the right place, but because the same bloodline that is woven through 8,000 years of this history produced 3 individuals who were, each in their own distinct way, exactly what the moment required. Bran first. Bran Stark, the boy who fell from a tower window in the very first episode of the show, pushed by Jaime Lannister, whose secret he had accidentally witnessed. Pushed because he was climbing, because he was always climbing, always reaching for higher vantage points, trying to see more than his small body down on the ground could show him. That compulsion, that deep need to see further, was not a personality quirk. It was an expression of what he was. A Stark child with green sight so powerful, it would eventually make him the three-eyed raven. Mild, the most complete greenseer any human had been in recorded history. The Weirwood network, every eye carved into every ancient tree across the continent, opened to him in a way it had not opened to anyone since the original three-eyed raven before him. The Night King wanted to erase Bran specifically because of what Bran was. Not what he could do in a battle. Bran could not fight, had not been able to walk since the fall, and was perhaps the most physically helpless of all the characters in Winterfell's Great Hall when the army of the dead arrived. What he represented was different. He was the living library of the world's memory. He was the thing that could look back through the Weirwood eyes and see the moment the Night King was created, see the long night, and see everything that had happened and been deliberately erased and suppressed over 8,000 years. If Bran died, that memory died with him. The darkness could be total. History could be over. Jon Snow, Jon Stark, as we come to understand him, born Aegon Targaryen, raised Stark, carrying in his body the literal convergence of ice and fire that the story has been promising from its very first page. The child of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen, the product of the North's most ancient magical bloodline, and the dragon-blooded house of the Conquerors, Jon was both the heir to the Iron Throne and the most battle-tested soldier against the White Walkers that the living world possessed. He had been at Hardhome. He had looked the Night King in the eyes across the blood-black water as the dead rose. He had killed White Walkers with Valyrian steel. He had been killed himself and resurrected by the Lord of Light through Melisandre, a resurrection that added to the layers of prophecy surrounding him. Whether Jon is Azor Ahai, the prince that was promised, remains one of the great unresolved questions of the mythology. The prophecy says Azor Ahai will be reborn among smoke and salt, which fits Jon's resurrection. It says he will wake dragons from stone, which Jon does, in a sense, through his Targaryen blood and his relationship with Daenerys and her dragons. It says the darkness will flee before him. What the prophecy does not say, and what the show ultimately subverts, is that Azor Ahai will be the one to deliver the killing blow to the leader of the dead. Jon stands at the center of the Night King's strategy. The Night King delays, mismaneuvers, directs his forces to keep Jon occupied, but the killing blow does not come from him. It comes from Arya. Arya Stark is the youngest of the three, the daughter who was told her destiny was embroidery and marriage, and the gracious management of someone else's household, who heard all of that and said no, absolutely not, and spent the entire story training herself into something that not a single person who knew her as a child could have predicted. Arya is not a greenseer. She cannot warg. She does not carry the particular quality of Stark magic that manifests in Bran, or even in Jon's dreams of his direwolf. What Arya has is something older than magic in the formal sense. She has the training of the faceless men of Braavos, an order of assassins who worship the many-faced god. All who is essentially death itself, combined with the ferocity and ingenuity of a Stark raised in the north. She has Needle, her sword, given to her by Jon Snow, made by Mikken the Smith of Winterfell, thin and quick like her. She has the cat's paw dagger, the Valyrian steel blade that passed from the Iron Throne through Littlefinger to Bran, who gave it to Arya, the same blade used in an assassination attempt on Bran in the very first season. Melisandre, the Red Priestess who claimed to see the future in flames, had told Arya something years before the Battle of Winterfell. She told her she would shut the eyes of many men. Brown eyes, blue eyes, green eyes. The blue eyes were not metaphorical. They were the Night King. They were the White Walkers. They were the army of the dead with their burning blue gaze. The Arya was always going to be the one. The show built to it across all 8 seasons, layer by layer, her training with Syrio Forel and King's Landing, her time among the faceless men, her stealth and speed and absolute refusal to be seen coming until it was too late. On the longest night in the Godswood of Winterfell, with Bran Stark sitting still and quiet in his chair beneath the Heart Tree, watching through weirwood eyes while the Night King's White Walkers formed a ring around them, Arya came through the dark, not slowly, not dramatically, like a thrown knife. The Night King heard something, turned, caught her by the throat in midair with one hand, and she let the Valyrian dagger fall from her right hand to her left, and she plunged it into his chest. He shattered. Every White Walker in the world shattered. Every white dropped where it stood. 8,000 years of patient darkness, 8,000 years of accumulated cold fury, ended in a moment, in a Godswood, at the hands of a Stark girl who had been told her whole life that she was not important enough to matter. Everything about the final confrontation circles back to the same center. The Night King's goal was Bran, a Stark. The place he died was Winterfell, the Stark ancestral home, built by the founder of their house on the ruins of whatever came before, woven through with the same ancient magic that connected the Starks to the Children of the Forest and through them to the Weirwood network. The weapon that killed him was Valyrian steel, given by one Stark to another. His killer was a Stark. The boy he was trying to kill was a Stark who sat in the Godswood, at the Heart Tree, and in the living center of the Stark family's connection to the ancient magical world. And the sword that could not kill him, the sword carried by the man everyone expected to deliver the killing blow, was Longclaw, a Valyrian steel sword named for a direwolf's claw, belonging to the Stark who was not quite a Stark. Jon could not kill the Night King because that was not his role in this particular history. Jon's role was the bridge. He was the one who made alliances that could not be made otherwise, who allied with the wildlings, who convinced Daenerys that the dead were more important than the throne, who assembled the coalition that made the Battle of Winterfell possible. He was the convergence point, the meeting place of ice and fire that the prophecy talked about. The song of ice and fire. He was the song, but songs do not kill. If daggers do? Part 10. What the lore truly means. Ism, the Stark motto. As prophecy, not warning, let us come back to the beginning, to the cold wind, to the motto, winter is coming. We have moved through 12,000 years of history, from the dawn age of the Children of the Forest, through the arrival of the first men, through the creation of the Night King and the Long Night, and the battle for the dawn, through Bran the Builder's wall and Winterfell, through the Night's King legend and 8,000 years of silence, through the return of the White Walkers and the deaths of the entire Stark family, except the ones who did not die, through the final confrontation in the Godswood at the castle that was built to be that Godswood's guardian. And in all of that, the through line has been clear. The Starks are not simply victims of proximity. They are not simply the brave northern family holding the front line while the South debates politics in comfortable halls. They are the specific, deliberate creation of a moment in history. The moment when the children of the forest's greatest catastrophic mistake needed to be managed, contained, eventually ended. Everything about who the Starks are, from their magic to their castle to their wars, is the inheritance of that original terrible decision and the attempt over thousands of years to make sure it could never win. Consider the significance of names alone. Bran. The great founder who built the wall in Winterfell is Bran the Builder. The boy who becomes the most powerful greenseer in living history is Bran Stark. The show's use of this naming is not accidental. There is a theory, unprovable, but narratively elegant, that Brandon Stark the young boy is in some sense a continuation of Brandon Stark the founder, that the green sight of the modern Bran allowed him to travel through the Weirwood network into the distant past, and that the Builder and the Broken are the same consciousness operating in different eras. The show gestures toward this without confirming it, but the name is repeated because the role is repeated. There must always be a Bran, just as there must always be a Stark in Winterfell. The pattern demands it. The deeper question that the lore raises, and that the show frustratingly cannot fully answer in the time it has, is this. Was any of this inevitable? Were the Starks locked into their role from the moment the children drove the dragonglass into the chest of whoever was tied to that weirwood tree? Was Bran the Broken, the young boy who fell from a window and became the three-eyed raven and eventually the king of the Six Kingdoms, walking a path that was always there, always waiting for him, carved by the accumulated weight of 8,000 years of a family maintaining a covenant they had long since forgotten the terms of? George R. R. Martin, asked about the fate and the meaning of his story, has said several things over the years that circle the same idea without quite stating it directly. He has talked about the coexistence of free will and prophecy in his world, the tension between what characters choose and what seems fated. He has talked about the costs of power and the way civilizations suffer for the sins of the desperate and the ambitious. It's the children of the forest made something they could not control and spent thousands of years paying for it. The Starks built their entire identity around containing the consequences of something they did not create but inherited, carrying a responsibility they could not even clearly articulate because the specific terms of it had been erased from history. The White Walkers in this reading are not simply the enemy. They are the consequence of a weapon made in desperation, the consequence of the hubris of believing that dark magic can be controlled and directed toward benign ends, the consequence of war itself, of two civilizations unable to find peace until both had suffered enough. The Long Night is not a random catastrophe. It is the bill coming due for 2,000 years of the mutual destruction between the children and the first men, and the Starks are the people who have to pay it. There is something about the direwolves that feels like the final piece of this particular puzzle. The direwolves that appear at the beginning of the story, 6 of them, 5 pups and a mother dead at the foot of a stag's antler, found north of the wall, south of the neck, well outside their natural range, have been interpreted by fans as an omen, a harbinger, a sign of magic returning to the world, which they are. But they are also the children of the forest connection, made flesh and fur, and running wildly through the narrative. The direwolves were always the companions of the wargs, the extension of the magical self outward into something warm and fierce and alive. Yet the Stark children who bond with these animals are, in a sense, reclaiming the ancient inheritance of their bloodline. The ability to step outside the limits of human perception and experience, the world in a way that allows them to see threats coming that human eyes would miss. Ghost, with Jon Snow, persists through everything. The White Wolf, ice-colored, nearly invisible in snow, surviving while the others die, still beside Jon when the story ends and Jon goes north of the wall to stay. The direwolf connection may be the deepest expression of what makes a Stark, not the stubborn honor, though that's there, not the fierce loyalty, though that's there too, but the connection to something older and wilder than human civilization, something that remembers the Dawn Age, something that can hear in a wolf's warning bark what no lord in any warm castle could recognize. There must always be a Stark in Winterfell, There must always be someone in the north who remembers, who keeps the fires burning, who names their children in the ancient language, who stands at the heart tree and puts their hands on the bark and opens just a little the channel that connects them to the long, watched memory of the world. Winter is coming, not as a threat, not anymore, as a reminder, as the thing the Starks carry in their blood like a cold, clean river, the knowledge that the world is older than any one kingdom, older than any one throne, and that the darkness does not forget even when the living choose to. The Starks are the ones who do not choose to forget. The Starks are the memory that the Night King needed to erase. Yes, the Starks are, in the end, the answer to the question their own house was built around. Why is there always a Stark in Winterfell? Because someone has to remember. Because the darkness is patient, and the living are comfortable, and comfort makes people blind. Because 8,000 years ago, a child was born who was marked by ice, and the mark did not pass through him cleanly, but left something in the world, a cold current in the blood of the North, and someone has to hold that current steady and make sure it does not tip from strength into surrender. Because winter is coming, it is always coming. It came once and the world nearly ended. It came again. And this time a girl with a dagger made of dragonbone forged steel caught it in the throat in a god's wood, while her brother sat quiet and her other brother burned in the dark, and the direwolves howled somewhere in the snow. And then winter fell. And for now, for this chapter of the story at least, the world was allowed to breathe. The history between the Starks and the White Walkers is not a history of opposition. It is a history of connection, of a bloodline that was shaped over thousands of years into precisely the instrument that could face what the children of the forest had made, not destined in some comfortable, everything works out way. Shaped, as metal is shaped by being subjected to great heat and great pressure, losing something in the process, but gaining something harder and more particular in its place. Said the Stark words are winter is coming, but the Stark nature is something more like, we know what winter is. We have always known what winter is. And when it comes again, we will be here, in the cold lands, in the old place at the heart of the ancient tree, with iron and Valyrian steel and the blood of 8,000 years of memory. Watching, waiting, remembering. Epilogue. What remains in the dark, the Night King is gone. Arya Stark killed him in the Godswood at Winterfell, and every White Walker in existence shattered like frozen glass at the same moment. The hive mind dissolved back into silence. The army of the dead fell. The long night, the second long night, the one that lasted only a single battle rather than a generation, because this time humanity was prepared in ways it had not been the first time, ended before the sun rose. Bran Stark became the king of the Six Kingdoms, a man without a personal name who was now almost entirely a channel for the ancient sight of the world, sitting on a repaired throne in a rebuilt city, looking at everyone and everything through eyes that had seen 8,000 years of history. Whether this is a happy ending depends on how you feel about the weight of that much memory being concentrated in a single mind that is also trying to govern. George R.R. Martin has suggested, without confirming, that Bran's story is not over, that the history he now carries and what he will do with it is still being written. Jon Snow went north, beyond the wall, which still stands in its reduced form, leading the free folk into the wilderness above it. He went with Ghost at his side. He went because he could not be contained in a world that wanted to put him in a room and debate what title to give him, because there was something in him, the Stark part, the northern blood, the wolf in him, that needed the cold open spaces above the world's last great barrier. Whether he goes to find something or to be something, the show does not say clearly. Arya went west, into the unknown ocean no one has sailed. She pointed the prow of her ship toward whatever lies beyond the edge of the known maps and let the wind take her. The girl who had been trained by death itself was no longer afraid of any mystery the world could present. Sansa became queen in the north, which is, in a deep sense, exactly what the lore always needed. A Stark in Winterfell, the North independent, the great chain maintained. Yes, these endings are not incidental. They map exactly onto the logic of the history we have spent this journey tracing. The ancient line maintained in the ancient place. The Greenseer installed where he can watch and remember. The Wolfman returned to the wilderness where wolves belong. The assassin set free into a world she has no more reason to be afraid of. The children of the forest are gone. Leaf died in Bran's time, throwing fire at the whites who came for the cave. The last of them disappeared into the deep north, beyond the wall, into the old places. Perhaps there are still a few of them somewhere, green-eyed and small, singing the songs of the earth to forests that no longer hear them clearly. Perhaps the Weirwood network still holds the memory of every greenseer who ever lived. It's a vast consciousness compressed into root and sap, and red leaves, watching with the carved eyes of 10,000 trees. And perhaps somewhere in that cold and silent north, in a land where the snow never fully melts and the ice runs so deep it touches the bones of the world, there is something that waits, patient, old, changed but not ended by the death of one being, because things that have existed as long as the cold itself do not entirely die when a single avatar of theirs is shattered. The White Walkers are gone, the Night King is gone. The Long Night has been averted for the second time in 8,000 years. But George R. Martin has never been in the business of endings that are entirely clean or threats that are entirely resolved. He writes about cycles, about the way history refuses to stay dead, about the way the things people choose to forget have a way of becoming, generation by generation, the things that kill them. Winter is coming. It is always coming. And someone has to be in Winterfell when it gets here. Thank you for spending this time with me in the deep lore of Westeros. We have walked through the entire secret history between the Starks and the White Walkers today, from the children of the forest in their ancient forests, through the creation of the Night King, through the Long Night and the Age of Heroes, through Bran the Builder's great works of stone and ice and magic, through the Night King's dark descent and Brandon the Breaker's heartbreaking solution, through 8,000 years of silence and the slow return of the cold, and finally through the Battle of Winterfell and the Stark children who fought and won and paid the price of that winning in ways the world will feel for generations. This is the kind of lore that makes Game of Thrones something more than a story about poor and betrayal and dragons. It is a mythology that goes all the way down, from the present political drama to something that feels genuinely ancient, genuinely earned, genuinely concerned with questions that matter. Why do families carry burdens they did not choose? What do civilizations owe to the crimes of their founders? What does it mean to remember, and what is the cost of forgetting? What do we build, and for whom, and how long does it last? The Starks built long. They built well. They built in stone and ice, and weirwood root and the blood of their own family. And when it was tested, it held. If you found something valuable in this exploration, please take a moment to like the video. It costs you nothing, and it helps more people find the channel, which means more deep dives into the corners of worlds like this one. And if you are new here, consider subscribing. There are so many more stories to tell in the histories of ice and fire, so many more mysteries to trace from their beginnings, so many more threads in this extraordinary mythology that deserve the careful attention they rarely receive. The lore lives as long as we keep telling the story. Until next time, may the light hold, may the walls stand, and may you always know what your own words mean, even when everyone around you has forgotten. Winter is coming. Make sure you remember why. Extended reflection, the language of ice and the language of wood. There is a reason the show chose to keep the White Walkers almost entirely silent. Their leader, the Night King, never speaks a single word of dialogue in any language across all 8 seasons of the show. He communicates through action and through gaze. Through that long, flat, measuring stare that he levels at Jon Snow across the water at Hardhome, an expression that carries no hatred, no triumph, no joy in destruction. He looks at Jon the way something might look at an old and interesting problem. As though Jon is a variable he has been accounting for across a very long timeline and finding present where expected, performing the predicted function. The show made this choice deliberately. Yet the director and the showrunners talked about it in interviews afterward. They wanted the Night King to feel like a force of nature, rather than a villain with motivations you could argue with, like winter itself. Winter does not explain itself. Winter does not justify the blizzard or the frostbite or the frozen river. It simply is, and you either prepare for it or you do not. But George R. Martin, in his books, writes the others, his name for the White Walkers, differently. They are not silent, they have a language. It is described as sounding like the cracking of ice, a high, crystalline sound that no human throat has been shaped to make. Linguists who work on the fictional worlds Martin builds have analyzed the fragments of White Walker speech that appear in the prologue of the very first book, where Sir Waymar Royce faces a White Walker in the dark forest, and hears it speak something cold and incomprehensible, and concluded that Scroth, as the language has been named, has a grammatical structure unlike any human language. Not inhuman in the sense of being disorganized or random, inhuman in the sense of being organized around entirely different principles, built for a mind that experiences time and space and relationship differently than any mind born to warmth. What would it mean to have a language built for cold intelligence? Say, a language whose grammar is organized around permanence rather than change, around the deep geological time of ice rather than the quick human time of seasons and dynasties? A language in which the present tense and the ancient past are perhaps the same tense, because from the perspective of something that has existed for 8,000 years, the difference between yesterday and 8 millennia ago is minimal? This is speculation. But it is informed speculation, the kind that Martin's densest lore invites and rewards. The others are not monsters in the way a dragon or a shadow cat is a monster. They are not appetite and fury. They are something that thinks, that plans, that communicates in a language made of cold, that looked at the world after the long night, retreated to the uttermost north, and spent 8,000 years in what we can only assume was some form of deliberate existence, waiting for conditions that would allow them to succeed where they had failed before. The creation of the Night King produced something that was human enough to understand human civilization, and cold enough to be entirely indifferent to it. The mind that went into that weirwood tree as a first man came out knowing everything a first man knew. The strengths of human armies, the vulnerabilities of human institutions, the way human memory fades and human attention wanders and human comfort breeds complacency, and combined it with the absolute, patient, unhurried perspective of something that does not grow old, does not tire, does not lose focus across the passage of centuries. And that experience is no particular urgency about timelines because it has all the time in the world. The Night King has been watching human civilization rise and fall for 8,000 years. He knows what it does. He knows how it works. He knows exactly how to wait for the moment when the living are too busy fighting each other to mount a unified defense. The timing of his return is not accidental. He comes back at the moment of maximum political fragmentation in Westeros' history. The War of Five Kings is tearing the continent apart. The Night's Watch is at its weakest and most underfunded in living memory. The great houses are consuming each other. Ned Stark, the most recent Lord of Winterfell, he has just been executed, removing from the political landscape the one man whose integrity and seriousness might have convinced the South to take the northern threat seriously. Jon Snow is a bastard with no political authority. Daenerys is in Essos with no certain path back to Westeros. The people who might have stood between the Night King and his goals are scattered, divided, stripped of legitimacy and resources. He did not choose this moment randomly. He chose it because it is the moment that 8,000 years of watching human civilization told him would come. The moment when the living were too busy being human, too busy with their grievances and their ambitions and their entirely justified grievances about entirely real injustices, to look north and see what was coming. In extended reflection, what Old Nan knew and how she knew it. Old Nan is one of the most interesting peripheral figures in Game of Thrones lore, and she is consistently underrated by people who focus on the major political players. She is an old woman in a castle, a caretaker of small children, a teller of bedtime stories that everyone around her dismisses as old women's rambling. She outlived her own children and grandchildren, some of whom were sworn to the Night's Watch, and she stayed in Winterfell because there was nowhere else for her to go, and because Winterfell was, in some sense, where someone like her needed to be. The stories she tells the Stark children are not random folktales. They are not comfortingly fictional. They are about real things, or they are about things that are presented as legend and turn out. Yet when the series reveals itself fully to have been entirely accurate, she tells Bran about the long night with a specificity that her claimed source, stories passed down through generations, cannot fully explain. She knows what cold means in a way that suggests personal familiarity. She knows what White Walkers feel like. She knows what whites do. She knows what the Night's King did and what happened to him. She is the most accurate narrator of the ancient history in the entire show, and she is also the most completely dismissed. Why does Old Nan know what she knows? One theory, and it is a compelling one that has circulated among the most attentive book readers for years, is that Old Nan's connection to Winterfell is not just domestic service. That a very old woman who lives inside the most magically significant castle in the north, who sleeps near the Heart Tree Godswood, who has perhaps in her extreme old age developed her own proximity to the Weirwood network, without anyone around her noticing, has been absorbing the memories stored in those roots the way someone sleeping in a warm house absorbs its heat. Not a green seer, not gifted, simply very old, very sensitive in the way that the very old sometimes become, when the ordinary noise of ambition and survival has quieted in them, and very, very close to a living archive of 8,000 years. She calls the Night King by the right name. She knows the right details. She tells Bran the version of the Night's King story that includes the possibility that he was a Stark. She says this calmly, as a fact she is not ashamed of, because Old Nan is not interested in what is convenient to believe. She is interested in what is true. And what is true, in the deep lore of the North, is that the Stark bloodline runs directly through every important moment in this history, including the darkest ones. She knows because the walls of Winterfell have been watching since before any of the people inside it were born. She knows because she is old enough and quiet enough and close enough to the listening wood to hear what the walls remember. Extended reflection, the spiral symbol and what it means. Throughout the series, the White Walkers leave a mark, a pattern, a symbol arranged from body parts, from stones, from the careful placement of corpses in a specific design that is not random and not decorative, but carries meaning that even the characters in the story struggle to decode. The spiral, a circle of some kind, the precise shape varying but always curving, always returning to itself, arranged with a deliberateness that clearly belongs to a mind with a plan rather than a creature merely marking territory. The symbol appears in multiple places across the story. In the opening scene of the very first episode, the Night's Watch Rangers find dead wildlings arranged in a pattern. At the Fist of the First Men, after the White Walker attack, the severed horse limbs are arranged in the same design. In Winterfell itself, after the army of the dead secures the north in its march south, the young Lord Umber is displayed pinned to a wall at the center of a spiral made of severed arms. In the land of always winter, the place where the Night King transforms Craster's sons, the ice formation around the altar is a spiral. Even the map shown in the opening credits of the show, a clockwork mechanism that builds the world as it turns, is itself a spiral design. What does it mean? The most persuasive interpretation draws a direct connection to the Children of the Forest. The children are the creators of the Night King. The spiral was apparently a significant symbol in their culture. Some scholars of the lore have noted that certain ancient sites associated with the children, including the arrangement of stones believed to have been used in their rituals, follow spiral patterns. The Weirwood network itself, in a sense, is a spiral, a set of roots radiating outward from centers and curving back, connecting across distances in a pattern that is not a grid, but something older and more organic. If the Night King was created in a ritual that involved the children's deepest magic, the most ancient and powerful forms of their sorcery, then the spiral may be the signature of that magic. The mark of the children, left by their greatest mistake, appearing everywhere their creation chooses to sign his work. The Night King kills and arranges his kills in the pattern that was carved into him at his creation. The way a person raised in a particular culture carries the habits of that culture, even when they have rejected everything else about it. The Night King has rejected everything about the world of the living, but he has not rejected the symbol that made him what he is. There is another possibility, darker and more interesting. The spiral, in many real-world ancient traditions and mythologies, represents cycles, the eternal return. Yet the idea that everything that happens will happen again. Time not as a straight line from past to future, but as a coil, repeating in patterns that are recognizable if you look at them from far enough away. If the Night King arranges the dead in spirals, perhaps he is not simply marking territory. Perhaps he is making a statement about what time is, about the nature of the story he believes himself to be in, a story that has happened before, because it has 8,000 years ago, the Long Night. And that will happen again. And will happen again after that. Endlessly cycling, the dead returning, and the living forgetting, and the cold coming back, patient and absolute, and the same families in the same places making the same choices and the same sacrifices. The Starks build walls against this. The Night King draws spirals beside them. In the two interpretations of the same reality, one saying, we can stop this, we can hold this, we can maintain the barrier and protect the warmth. The other saying, nothing holds, everything cycles. The wall will fall as it fell before, the night will come as it came before, and the cold is not your enemy. The cold is just the world, being what it always was before you arrived in it, and will be after you are gone. Whether or not you find that second interpretation plausible depends on how much mercy you extend to a being made of ice and 8,000 years of unasked-for existence. Extended reflection. Why the Night King goes for Bran. The memory wars. The Night King's specific obsession with Bran Stark is the most important element of the endgame, and it is worth spending time on why, because the show does not make it entirely explicit. Yet the Night King wants to kill Bran. He organizes the entire invasion around reaching Bran. He uses the undead dragon Viserion not simply to destroy the wall, which he could have done in other ways, but to create a path directly toward Winterfell, directly toward Bran. He maneuvers at the Battle of Winterfell in ways that sacrifice opportunities to maximize total casualties in favor of cutting a path through the castle's defenses to the Godswood where Bran is waiting. The Three-Eyed Raven, the entity that Bran became by absorbing the previous Three-Eyed Raven's consciousness during the Night King's attack on the cave, is described as the world's memory. The previous Three-Eyed Raven, Brynden Rivers, also called Lord Bloodraven, is a bastard son of a Targaryen king who lived for over a century and disappeared north of the Wall long before the events of the main story, had been sitting in the cave for decades, merged with the Weirwood, accumulating the accumulated sight of all the children's green seers who had passed their consciousness into the network at death. He passed all of that to Bran, everything the Weirwood network had ever stored. Every memory of every green seer and every warg who had ever opened their mind to the listening trees. 8,000 years of accumulated sight, all in Bran's head. If Bran dies, that dies. Not the physical Weirwood trees, they would persist, but the living human interface through which the accumulated memory could be accessed and interpreted and used. The pure archive of wood and root would remain. All but without a green seer capable of fully accessing it, it would be like a library that no one can read. Locked, inert, containing everything and yielding nothing. What could Bran do with that memory that the Night King needed to prevent? In the show, the answer presented is somewhat abstract. Bran can record history, pass it on, ensure that the living world is not entirely lost to darkness and forgetting. But a more specific answer is possible if you think about what a fully realized Three-Eyed Raven could actually do. The previous Three-Eyed Raven could see events happening at great distances and at different points in time simultaneously. He could warn people about threats before they materialized. He could coordinate a defense that no merely human intelligence could coordinate. It's because he had access to information no merely human intelligence could have. He was a strategic asset of almost incomprehensible power, if he had chosen to use his abilities that way, rather than simply watching. What if the Night King's goal was not simply to kill the Three-Eyed Raven, but to become the Three-Eyed Raven? What if whatever the Night King is, a being who was created from a human whose particular qualities resonated with the magic of the Weirwood, was always going to need, eventually, the full access to the Weirwood network that only the Three-Eyed Raven possessed? The Night King was created using the Weirwood as an instrument, tied to the same Weirwood tree in the Vision, connected to the same magical network from the moment of his creation. But he was denied access to it. The children built the Night King as a weapon, not as a green seer. They gave him the transformation without the full inheritance. Killing Bran and taking whatever he possessed as the Three-Eyed Raven would not merely erase the world's memory. It might have completed something, given the Night King access to a network he had always been connected to but never controlled. Made him not just the king of the dead, but the keeper of everything the living world had ever known. The absolute darkness, unwitnessed and unremembered by anyone. This is why a Stark had to be in Winterfell, because the Starks were the people who, generation by generation, maintained the living human connection to the Weirwood network. Every Stark who sat in that Godswood and prayed was feeding the connection. Every Stark with green sight, every Stark warg, and every Stark who passed their own final awareness into the roots at death was adding their thread to the Great Weave. The Stark bloodline is not just connected to the magic of the old gods. It is the primary human maintenance crew for that magic. They are the living interface between human consciousness and an ancient memory system that holds everything worth remembering about the world. And that is exactly what the Night King needed to end. Extended reflection, dragonglass, Valyrian steel, and the weapons that remember what made them. The two substances that can kill White Walkers, dragonglass and Valyrian steel, are not random choices. They carry within them the history of the world's two great magical traditions, and their ability to harm creatures of ice tells you something important about the nature of those creatures. In a dragonglass is obsidian, volcanic glass, formed in the intense heat of geological activity, in the deepest places where the Earth's internal fire pushes against the surface. The children of the forest used it for weapons long before they used it for anything else. Their arrowheads and blades were made from the stuff. And then, crucially, they used a shard of it to create the Night King. They drove it into a man's chest and transformed him from warm to cold, from living to something beyond living. The resonance is almost alchemical. The substance that created the White Walkers, that particular compressed volcanic fire, also destroys them. The weapon that made the first White Walker also unmakes every White Walker it touches. This is not a coincidence in Martin's mythology. It is the logic of a world where magic has rules even when those rules are not fully legible to the people living inside it. Fire created the cold. Fire defeats the cold. The same material, the same fundamental force, the transformation and the undoing encoded in the same substance. Valyrian steel is fire magic of a different kind. Forged in dragonfire, worked with spells that the Valyrian smiths kept so closely guarded that they died with the doom. Every Valyrian steel blade is a piece of preserved fire magic, the heat of a living dragon's breath, captured in metal through a ritual that nobody alive in the present day fully understands. Combined with steel folded thousands upon thousands of times until the rippled patterns visible in the finished blade speak to a density of structure no ordinary forging can achieve. A Valyrian steel blade is not simply a very good sword. It is a very old fire, preserved in metal form, still carrying whatever property of dragonflame made it capable of shaping the hard magic of the world. The cat's paw dagger, the specific blade Arya uses to kill the Night King, has a history that the show traces through multiple seasons with almost obsessive care. It belongs to the Iron Throne initially, passes through multiple hands, is used in the assassination attempt on Bran in the very first season, ends up with Littlefinger, is given to Bran by Littlefinger in Season 7 as a calculated move, and then Bran immediately gives it to Arya, as though Bran knew, through the Weirwood site, exactly where it needed to go. As though the dagger had always been meant for Arya's hand in the Godswood on that particular night, and every hand it passed through before that was simply delivering it to its destination. Valyrian steel, made with dragonfire, forged by the fire of the Targaryens' great empire, which itself was built on the same fundamental magical fire that the world's two great powers, the children of the forest and the old gods of the north, have always been in relationship with. The weapon that killed the Night King is itself a convergence. Fire magic, preserved in steel, carried by a Stark girl to the heart of the Stark family's most ancient magical space, and driven into the chest of a being made from ice and transformed blood. Ice and fire, the song of the world, played out in a single instant in a god's wood in the north. Its extended reflection, the free folk and their relationship to the old history. We should not move toward the ending of this journey without spending time on a people who have been present in the background of this entire history. Watching from just north of the wall, living inside the shadow of everything we have been discussing, maintaining a relationship to it all that is fundamentally different from any Southerner's perspective. The free folk, the wildlings. The free folk are the descendants of the first men who chose to stay north of the wall when it was built, or more accurately, who were on the wrong side of it when it went up, or who refused to come south when they were invited to, or who had their own very good reasons for wanting to remain in the lands where they had always lived. All from the perspective of the people south of the wall, they are raiders and savages, ungovernable and dangerous. From their own perspective, they are free, which is where the name comes from, and they have a relationship to the genuine history of the world that the comfortable people of the south entirely lack. The free folk know the White Walkers are real. They have never stopped knowing it. They cannot afford the comfortable southern amnesia that let the Andals cut down the weirwoods and declare the old gods imaginary, because the things the old gods' magic was keeping at bay are right there, beyond the next ridge, in the next valley, in the stories that their grandmothers told them that sound exactly like old Nan's stories because they come from the same source. There is a reason that wildlings burn their dead. Every wildling burn is an act of resistance against the specific power of the Night King and his army. You cannot raise what has been given to fire. The Free Folk's most important leader in the present-day story, Mance Rayder, understood something that took Jon Snow half the series to fully accept. The wildlings had no interest in the political games of the Seven Kingdoms. They had never pledged loyalty to any king in the South. They lived their own lives by their own customs, complicated and often brutal, in a world that was genuinely harder than anything most Southerners would survive. And they were moving south because whatever lay north of them had become impossible to remain near. This is significant. The Free Folk's northward movement, the gathering of hundreds of thousands of scattered tribes and clans into the largest migration in their recorded history, was not a strategic decision made by a unified command. It was people fleeing, separately, from different directions, arriving at similar conclusions. The cold is changing. The things in the cold are moving. We cannot stay. This is the first sign, in the show's present day, that the Night King's advance has begun. Not the Whites at the Wall, not the Ravens from the Watch, the wildlings running south. Jon Snow is the character who bridges these two worlds. He is a Stark. In the ways that matter, he is entirely a Stark, even if his blood is half Targaryen, who goes north of the Wall, lives among the Free Folk, learns their way of looking at the world, falls in love with Ygritte, and comes back changed in a way that makes him impossible to fit neatly into any existing political category. He knows what the Free Folk know. He has seen what the Free Folk have seen. And when he eventually forges the alliance with the wildlings that allows the living to survive the Battle of Winterfell, he is doing something that has a precise historical parallel. The same alliance between a Stark king and a king beyond the Wall that brought down the Night's King 8,000 years before. Everything in this story has happened before, the Stark and the Wildling King working together, the alliance that should be impossible because of the wall between them, the crisis that forces them to recognize they are on the same side. Jon Snow and Mance Rayder. Brandon the Breaker and Jorah Moon. The same shape, 8,000 years apart, in because the same problem has returned and the same solution was always going to be required. Extended reflection, the three-eyed raven's long game. Brynden Rivers, called Bloodraven, was one of the most fascinating figures in the history of Westeros before he disappeared north of the Wall. He was the bastard son of King Aegon IV, a king remembered as Aegon the Unworthy, the worst of the Targaryen monarchs, whose legitimization of all his bastard children at his death plunged Westeros into a series of devastating wars. Bloodraven survived those wars, served as Hand of the King, was known as a spy master of terrifying effectiveness, and eventually exiled himself, or was exiled to the Night's Watch, and from there disappeared beyond the Wall entirely. He found the cave. He found the last of the Children of the Forest, who were waiting there with their accumulated sight and their dwindling numbers, still keeping the Weirwood network alive as long as any of them breathed. He allowed himself to be merged with the Weirwood. He became the Three-Eyed Raven, a being who was simultaneously a human man and a living node in an 8,000-year-old magical archive, looking through every Weirwood eye across the continent simultaneously. He spent, by the timeline of the main story, decades in that cave, just watching, not acting, not sending messages, not warning anyone, just watching through the Weirwood eyes as Westeros stumbled toward its crises, as the Night King stirred in the north, as the last dragons died and were born again, watching and waiting for Bran Stark. Why Bran specifically? The Three-Eyed Raven reached out to Bran after his fall. In his coma visions, with a specificity that was not random. He knew who Bran was. He had been watching the Stark family. He had seen Bran's mother, Catelyn, and his father, Ned. And in the deeper layers of the Weirwood memory, he had seen all the Starks before them. He knew what the Stark bloodline was. He knew what it was capable of. And he knew that whatever ability Bran had been born with, the raw, unformed green sight that expressed itself as falling dreams and raven visions even before his training began, was the most powerful raw material for a three-eyed raven that had been born since perhaps the age of heroes itself. He was not simply training a successor, he was recognizing the culmination of a very long process. The children of the forest began integrating the Stark bloodline with the old magic thousands of years ago. Yes, every generation since had added something to that integration. Bran was the result, a Stark child so thoroughly connected to the magical inheritance of his bloodline that he could, with proper training, become the most complete greenseer any living human had ever been. The living memory of the world, housed in the most magically significant First Men bloodline on the continent. Bloodraven waited for Bran because Bran was always the destination. Everything in the Stark family's history was building toward the moment when a Bran would sit in the cave and absorb everything and become the thing that the Night King needed most to destroy and that the living world needed most to have. That is a patient game, a very, very patient game. But patience, in this mythology, belongs to the weirwood. It belongs to the old things. Yet it belongs to anyone willing to take the long view. The Starks always took the long view. Winter is coming is the longest view in Westeros politics. It always was. Extended reflection. Jon Snow's resurrection and what it means in the larger pattern. There is one element of this history that deserves its own careful attention before we close, and it is the resurrection of Jon Snow. He is killed by his own brothers of the Night's Watch at the end of Season 5, stabbed in the courtyard of Castle Black with a series of blades, betrayed by men who feared what his alliances with the wildlings meant, who could not see far enough or clearly enough to understand that every choice Jon was making was in service of the only war that actually mattered. He dies in the snow. He lies there cold and still. And then Melisandre, one of the Red Priestess who has served the Lord of Light for decades, and who has spent the entire story believing that Stannis Baratheon is the chosen hero, Azor Ahai reborn, performs the resurrection ritual over Jon's body. Uncertain it will work, uncertain of everything she thought she knew about the Lord of Light's purpose. And Jon comes back, in a world with an established magical theology. The Lord of Light, whose followers believe that he stands in eternal opposition to the Great Other, the god of darkness and death, who the White Walkers serve. Resurrection is not just a narrative convenience, it is a theological statement. The Lord of Light brought back a person who was dead because that person had a role to play in the war against the Great Other. Not just because that person was likable or heroic, and not just because the audience wanted him to survive, but because the divine force opposed to the Night King chose to intervene in the natural order of death to keep a specific Stark-adjacent person alive for a specific purpose. The smoke from the candles Melisandre uses, the salt of her tears. He wakes born amid smoke and salt, breathing in a cold kissel at the edge of the world. The prophecy of Azor Ahai, born amid smoke and salt, waking from darkness. Jon Snow's resurrection fits the prophecy better than any other candidate in the story. And the implications of that fit are significant. If Jon is the prince that was promised, if he is Azor Ahai reborn, then the Lord of Light himself, or whatever force that theological label gestures toward, recognized in this half-Stark, a half-Targaryen boy, the specific combination of fire and ice magic that the moment required, not a purely fire-born hero like Daenerys, not a purely ice-rooted guardian like Bran. Both. The convergence, the song. That he does not deliver the killing blow to the Night King is a subversion of prophecy, but it is not a repudiation of it. Prophecies in Martin's world are not instruction manuals. They are the shape of something true described in language that can only approximate what it is pointing at. Jon's role was never simply to stab the Night King. His role was to make the killing possible, to forge the alliance with the wildlings, to convince Daenerys that the dead mattered more than the throne, to be present at Hardhome so that the Night King would underestimate the living's capacity to respond, to be in the Godswood at Winterfell, drawing the Night King's attention at the moment Arya came through the dark. He is the distraction. He is the bridge. He is the thing the Night King has to account for. And while the Night King is accounting for him, a Stark girl with fire in her hand and cold in her eyes finishes what 8,000 years of history started. The Lord of Light brought Jon back for that. Not to be the hero of a single moment, but to be the convergence point of a coalition that could not have existed without him. The Stark blood runs true, even in a man who does not carry the Stark name. Jon Snow is Jon Stark in everything that matters for this story. He was raised in Winterfell's Godswood. He prayed to the old gods. He carries the wolf in him as surely as any of his siblings. And the Lord of Light, well, when he made his move and brought a dead man back to the snow of Castle Black, chose someone who was ice and fire both, because that is exactly what the final battle required. Everything, in the end, comes back to Winterfell. Everything comes back to the Godswood. Everything comes back to the weirwood tree that has been standing there since Bran the Builder placed the first stone above the hot springs, watching with its carved red eyes, holding in its roots the memory of everything that has ever happened under its gaze. The Stark story is not over in the larger mythology. The books have not finished it. The world George R. R. Martin is still building has more of this to say. But what we can say with certainty, looking at what has been written and what has been shown, is that the Starks and the White Walkers were never simply enemies. Since they were always two expressions of the same ancient relationship, the relationship between the living world and the cold, between the memory of warmth and the fact of winter, between the human need to build and preserve, and the natural world's ultimate indifference to anything built or preserved. The cold is coming. It always comes. The Starks remember this. They have always remembered it. They built their castle above hot springs and carved their motto into the stone and named their children the same names over and over again across thousands of years, keeping the chain unbroken, keeping the covenant alive so that when winter came in full force, there would be a Stark in Winterfell to face it. There was, there always has been, there always will be. Winter is coming, and so are the Starks.